A pilot was preparing to take off on an international flight. A canine dog suddenly blocked his path, refusing to let him board the plane. What started as a puzzling reaction turned into an urgent inspection and ultimately a warning that saved hundreds of lives. This is the true story of Bruno, a dog once underestimated, but who thwarted a sophisticated terrorist plot with nothing more than his nose and unwavering loyalty. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching this video from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on inspiring true stories about heroic canines. Beneath the cold fluorescent lights casting their glow over the gray tile floor of Terminal 5's International Concourse, Security Officer Ethan Cole tugged his windproof uniform collar closer. His breath formed faint wisps, blending into the stream of people trickling toward the security checkpoints. January in Chicago knew no gentleness. Outside, a fresh layer of snow was falling heavily, blanketing the runways in a thick, white shroud that slowed everything. Passengers dragging their feet, flights stacking up in delays, and the usual bustle of O'Hare grinding to a near halt. The air bit at Ethan's knuckles as he flexed them, a habit from years of working in unforgiving weather. His mind half on the task ahead, half on the bitter cold seeping through the terminal's glass walls. At his side, Bruno, a 3-year-old black and tan shepherd, moved in sync at the heel position to his left. His gait was fluid, like water slipping over stones, his dark brown eyes scanning the crowd with a focus that bordered on supernatural. Not everyone on the team understood Bruno. Some veteran officers, grizzled from decades of service, had once dubbed him the scent calculator, a nickname born of equal parts mockery and awe. He wasn't impulsive like other canines, nor driven by the raw, bounding instinct that defined the breed's reputation. Bruno paused, analyzed, assessed, then reacted, a trait that had nearly gotten him dropped from the federal training program back when he was just a lanky pup with too much curiosity and not enough haste. But Ethan understood and trusted him completely. He'd seen too many dogs charge headlong into mistakes, barking at shadows or lunging at decoys, their handlers scrambling to rein them in. Bruno was different. He didn't waste energy on false alarms. He didn't need to prove himself with noise or speed. His silence was his strength, and Ethan had learned to listen to it. A lesson forged through countless patrols, quiet moments, and a bond that went beyond words. "Still not giving up because of the snow, huh, buddy?" Ethan murmured, stepping past the information desk, his hand brushing lightly behind Bruno's ear. The dog tilted his head slightly, not turning back, but his tail gave a faint wag, a signal Ethan had come to recognize as, "I'm fine." It was their shorthand, a private language built over years of working side by side, where a twitch of an ear or a shift in posture said more than any command ever could. Bruno didn't need coddling or loud praise. He just needed Ethan to be there, to trust him, and to follow when the time came. O'Hare Airport's complex was a chaotic hive at that moment. Over 200 flights had been delayed in the past 24 hours, a cascade of cancellations and reschedulings triggered by the storm. Digital boards flickered with constant updates of delayed and gate change, their red and white letters a relentless drumbeat of frustration. Passengers clustered around announcement pillars, eyes strained from staring at screens. Phones clutched tightly as they barked complaints to airline staff or muttered curses under their breath. The air buzzed with tension, a low hum of impatience and exhaustion that Ethan could feel pressing against his temples as he navigated the throng. Ethan and Bruno pressed on down the corridor, linking the international departure gates, their steps a steady rhythm against the chaos. Every few paces, Bruno dipped his nose toward a suitcase or an abandoned bag, inhaled deeply, then moved on, a seamless routine honed through hundreds of hours working together. They didn't need much talk. A slight tug on the leash, a whispered command, or just a shift in Bruno's breathing was enough for Ethan to catch his meaning. It was a partnership of instinct and intuition, a dance where each knew the other's moves without needing to look. Ethan had worked with other dogs before, hot-headed ones that yanked at their leads, eager to chase every scent. But none had clicked with him like Bruno. There was a quiet certainty to the dog that steadied Ethan, even on days when the world felt like it might unravel. Just as they passed the crew and technical staff security checkpoint, Bruno stopped. Ethan hadn't signaled anything. He instantly sensed the shift. The way Bruno's body tensed, ears perked, legs rooted in place as if the tiled floor had turned to glue. It was as if a camera had just locked onto its target, the world narrowing to a single point. Ethan crouched, gently tightening the lead, his knees creaking faintly from the cold. He studied Bruno's stance, the slight forward lean, the rigid line of his spine, the way his nostrils flared almost imperceptibly. Something was wrong. Ethan didn't know what yet, but he'd learned long ago not to question that stillness. It was Bruno's way of shouting without making a sound. "What's up, Bruno?" The question didn't need an answer. Bruno growled, a low, steady rumble from his throat, deep and resonant like distant thunder. Then less than 2 seconds later, a loud bark echoed out, sharp and commanding, cutting through the terminal's din like a blade. The sound reverberated through the enclosed space, startling a few passengers into turning around, their faces a mix of annoyance and curiosity. Ethan's eyes darted to where Bruno was staring, a tall man in a crisp, deep blue pilot's uniform, impeccable almost to a fault, standing out amid the rumpled travelers like a figure carved from marble. Captain Ryan Maddox. Ethan recognized him immediately. Maddox was a familiar face at this airport, a fixture in the pilot's lounge, and a name that floated through staff chatter. 15 years of experience, a specialist in long-haul transatlantic routes, once praised in an internal newsletter for handling a cockpit depressurization at 35,000 feet with the calm of a surgeon. His uniform bore not a single crease, aviator glasses hung neatly from his collar, and a shoulder bag bore the American Airlines logo, slung with the casual precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Ethan had seen him dozens of times, nodding in passing, a man who exuded competence and control. And Bruno, who had never reacted to airline staff, not once in their years together, was barking like he detected explosives in a carry-on. "Bruno, heel," Ethan commanded in a low voice, trying to stay calm, his pulse quickening despite himself. No response. Bruno yanked the leash hard, growled again, then lunged forward, planting himself directly in front of Maddox as the pilot approached the crew boarding gate. It was a clear defensive move, not an attack, his body a solid wall of fur and muscle, but enough to make nearby onlookers step back, their murmurs rising like static. Ethan tightened his grip, feeling the tension ripple up the leash into his arm. This wasn't Bruno's usual behavior, not the playful nudge for attention or the bored yawn of a slow shift. This was something else, something primal and urgent. "Please control your dog," Maddox said, his tone sharp but restrained, a faint edge of irritation breaking through his polished demeanor. "I've got a flight in less than an hour." Ethan raised a hand, signaling the checkpoint team to hold off, his eyes flicking between Maddox and Bruno. The security staff exchanged glances. Everyone could see something was off, a ripple of unease spreading through the group like a stone dropped in still water. "Sorry, Captain," Ethan replied, keeping his voice even, though his mind raced. "But Bruno never reacts like this, unless there's a reason. I need you to hold up for a moment so we can check further." "Sure." Maddox frowned, glancing around, his jaw tightening as he took in the growing cluster of passengers. Some pulling out phones to record, their whispers turning to a low buzz. A pilot blocked by a dog in the middle of an airport wasn't an everyday sight, and the scene was already teetering on the edge of spectacle. Ethan could feel the weight of those eyes, the unspoken questions hanging in the air, but he kept his focus on Bruno, on the dog's unyielding stare. "I've already cleared internal screening," Maddox said, his voice rising slightly, a crack in his composure. "You don't have the authority to stop me from boarding over an unruly dog." Bruno barked again, louder this time, the sound bouncing off the walls like a gunshot. He stood firm in the pathway, eyes locked on Maddox without blinking for a second. his body a statue of resolve. Ethan's chest tightened. He'd seen Bruno alert before, on training runs, on quiet patrols, but never with this intensity, this insistence. It wasn't aggression, it was certainty. Ethan dropped lower beside Bruno, resting a hand on his neck, feeling the heat of his fur against his palm. "Hey, easy! Tell me, what did you pick up?" Bruno tilted his head slightly to the right, a subtle shift most wouldn't notice. Then he let out a soft whine, a sound Ethan knew well, a signal etched into their shared history. It didn't mean immediate danger, but it was an early warning, a red flag flapping in the wind. Something was wrong, not yet clear what, but enough to flip Bruno into alert mode, his senses honed to a razor's edge. And from experience, Ethan knew Bruno was never wrong, not once. Not in the years they'd walked these halls together, not in the countless times his nose had caught what machines and men missed. Ethan's mind flashed back to those moments, the small victories, the quiet triumphs, and the truth settled in his gut like a stone. Whatever Bruno had sensed, it was real, and it was here. From a distance, a woman in a gray suit approached quickly, her heels clicking against the tile with purpose. It was the airport's security supervisor, Natalie Brooks, a no-nonsense figure Ethan had worked under for years. "What's going on, Cole?" Ethan straightened, pointing toward Maddox, who was now visibly losing patience, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal, sizing up an escape. "Bruno's reacting strongly to Captain Maddox. I want to request an additional check." Natalie glanced at Bruno, then at Ethan, her sharp eyes narrowing as she weighed the situation. A brief second passed, a heartbeat of silence amid the terminal's clamor, and she nodded. "All right, follow protocol. I'll handle the airline." Ethan gestured, a quick flick of his wrist. A team tasked with screening carry-ons and crew members swiftly moved in, their movements practiced and precise. Maddox raised a hand about to make a call, his fingers hovering over his phone. But Natalie stepped forward, blocking him with the calm authority of someone who'd faced down worse. "Sorry, Captain. Your phone will be held temporarily until the check's complete." "This is an overreach," Maddox snapped, his voice a low growl now, the polish peeling away to reveal something raw beneath. Ethan didn't reply. He leaned down to Bruno, whispering so only the dog could hear. "Good job. I'll trust you this time, like every other time." Bruno didn't bark. He just stood still, eyes never leaving Maddox, as if he'd already seen something everyone else in the room had missed, a shadow lurking just beyond the light. Under protocol, Ethan Cole had less than 3 minutes to make a decision that could disrupt the airport's peak hour operations. A call that could ripple through schedules, headlines, and his own career. The clock in his head ticked louder than the chatter around him, each second a weight pressing against his chest. Bruno stood barring Captain Ryan Maddox, teeth slightly bared, ears upright like antennas catching every movement, every breath. He didn't bark anymore, but the way the fur along his spine bristled like an invisible warning fence spoke volumes to Ethan. It was a language he'd learned to read, a silent code that had guided them through years of patrols, from mundane bag checks to moments that still haunted his dreams. Bruno's stillness wasn't hesitation, it was a verdict. "Please get your dog under control. I don't have time for this," Maddox growled, his voice tighter now, a thread of desperation weaving through it. "Do you know who's waiting for me? 243 passengers. One of them's a little girl with an ultra-rare metabolic disorder needing urgent transport to a hospital in London. Her parents have been waiting since last night." He cast his gaze around as if rallying sympathy from the crowd, and it worked. A few passengers began murmuring, pointing, their voices a soft chorus of judgment. Someone pulled out a phone and started filming, the red light of the camera a pinprick in Ethan's peripheral vision. Maddox was playing a card, and it was a good one. Humanity, urgency, a child's life. Ethan felt the pressure shift, the crowd's mood tilting against him, but he kept his eyes on Bruno. Maddox seized the momentum, lowering his voice as if addressing everyone, his words measured for maximum impact. If that girl dies because I'm delayed too long over a misbehaving dog, her blood's on your hands. Ethan didn't answer right away, but his heart was pounding, a steady thump against his ribs. He could picture the girl, the parents, the hospital bed waiting across the ocean, details Maddox wielded like a weapon. Doubt flickered at the edges of his mind, a whisper asking if he was wrong, if Bruno was wrong. But then he looked at the dog, at the unyielding focus in those brown eyes, and the doubt evaporated. Bruno didn't care about stories or guilt trips. He cared about truth. Bruno didn't react to the words. He turned, circling slowly around Maddox's bag, a standard pilot's flight satchel, slung crossbody, custom-made for the job, its leather-worn but pristine. He sniffed along every edge, every seam, every zipper, his nose tracing invisible lines. Each movement was deliberate, precise, as if Bruno were double-checking something, running a mental checklist no one else could see. Ethan watched, breath held, recognizing the pattern. This wasn't a casual sniff. This was verification. Ethan sensed the anomaly. Bruno was testing himself. He'd seen it before, in training drills and quiet shifts, when Bruno would linger over a scent, circle back, not out of uncertainty, but out of a refusal to be wrong. It was why he'd nearly flunked out of the program. Too slow, too methodical for a system that prized speed over accuracy. But Ethan had seen the payoff. A dog who didn't just find trouble, but found the right trouble. Say something. Nah, Maddox snapped, turning to supervisor Natalie Brooks, his voice cutting through the hum of the crowd. I've been a lead pilot with American Airlines for 15 years, never held up by a dog. This is an insult. I demand to speak to the airport commander. Natalie stayed calm, her eyes shifting to Ethan, a silent question in her gaze. Cole? Ethan crouched beside Bruno, whispering like to a teammate, his voice soft but steady. What is it, boy? What did you smell? Right then, Bruno growled again, louder, sharper, a heightened alert Ethan had only heard a few times, each etched into his memory like scars. The last was when they'd found explosive residue in a fuel truck's tank at a cargo dock, a discovery that had earned Ethan a commendation, and Bruno a rare pat from the chief. This growl was the same, urgent, unyielding, a sound that bypassed words and went straight to instinct. Bruno stepped back half a pace, then lunged toward the bag, not biting, not tearing, but slamming his paws hard on the floor, scratching relentlessly at the bag's edge. The sound of claws on tile grated against the terminal's noise, a raw, insistent rhythm. Ethan held his breath, his hand tightening on the leash until his knuckles whitened. This wasn't a guess. This was a demand. By now, everyone within a 10-meter radius had stopped, a ring of onlookers forming like ripples in a pond. An airport technician, half hidden behind a cart, whispered to a coworker, "Did the dog hit on something?" The question hung in the air, unanswered but heavy. Maddox's face flushed, a red tide creeping up his neck. What's in my bag is flight documents, navigation gear, and some personal items. Everything's cleared internally. If you don't end this farce soon, I'll sue federally. Oh. Bruno barked once more, this time nearly deafening, the sound piercing enough to make a child in the passenger line cry, her wail echoing faintly. He scratched harder, his paws leaving faint marks on the floor, then looked up at Ethan, an expression only veteran K-9 handlers would read. We can't let this guy go. It was a look Ethan had seen before, a silent plea backed by certainty, and it hit him like a punch. Natalie stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. Cole, if you order an official search, the airline will escalate straight to TSA. It's peak hour, press is here. The media will spin this into a scandal in 30 minutes. Ethan knew. He also knew refusing a seasoned pilot boarding over unusual dog behavior wasn't in the official handbook, not in any section he'd memorized during training. Without evidence, he'd face an internal review, possibly suspension, maybe worse. His career flashed before him, a decade of service, late nights, hard-earned respect, all teetering on this moment. But he also knew Bruno. Bruno, the dog once deemed too analytical to react fast enough for standard trials, was the first to detect a detonator controller hidden in a laptop bag, one that had slipped past next-gen scanners during a drill 2 years back. Ethan still remembered the tech's stunned faces, the way the room had gone quiet as Bruno sat, unwavering beside the bag. Bruno, the silent one, never reacting from emotion, never barking at strangers, never moving unless certain, was sounding an urgent alarm now, his body a living signal Ethan couldn't ignore. "Bruno," Ethan whispered, voice lower, rougher with the weight of the choice. "You sure?" The dog lifted his head, locked eyes with Ethan for a few seconds, long enough for Ethan to see the depth of that gaze, the absolute conviction in it, then growled softly once more, a sound that vibrated through Ethan's hand on his neck. That was enough. Ethan stood tall, his shoulders squaring as he met Natalie's eyes. "I'm requesting an expanded search. Take Captain Maddox to secondary screening. Secure his luggage. No access to phones or signaling devices." Natalie blinked, surprised, a rare crack in her composure. "You sure?" Ethan nodded, not looking at her, his focus still on Bruno. "I'm choosing to trust my partner." Maddox shot a furious glare at Ethan, his eyes blazing with something darker than anger. Fear, maybe, or desperation. "You just tanked your career, Officer Cole." Ethan didn't reply, but as Bruno quietly returned to heel, his eyes stayed on the bag, as if ready to act again if needed, a sentinel guarding a truth no one else could see. Ethan crouched, patting Bruno's neck softly, his fingers sinking into the thick fur. "We're in this together, buddy. But if you're right, you just saved hundreds." Bruno didn't respond, just wagged his tail faintly, enough for Ethan to know. He was certain as the snow falling outside, as certain as the ground beneath their feet. Natalie pressed her radio, her voice clipped and professional. "Delta 4 security team, prep screening room 2. Subject is crew, no force." Ethan spoke softly, almost just for Bruno, his breath visible in the cold air. "I trust you. One more time, Bruno." Bruno tilted his head, then stepped forward half a pace, not to close in, but as if affirming, "Yes, this guy's trouble." Ethan felt a surge of pride, a quiet thrill that steadied his nerves. Whatever came next, he wasn't alone. He had Bruno. On the way to the screening room, Maddox walked between two security officers, his polished facade crumbling with every step. His impatience grew more apparent, a restless energy spilling out. His steps grew heavier, thudding against the tile like a drumbeat, shoulders taut, sweat beading at his temples. Whether from anger, stress, or the cold, it wasn't clear. But Bruno maintained a steady distance, always slightly behind to the right, watching every subtle reaction with the focus of a hawk. Ethan could see it in the way Maddox's hands twitched, the way his eyes flicked toward exits, signs of a man who knew more than he let on. Ethan noticed Bruno never took his eyes off Maddox, even as they crossed crowded areas where the noise swelled. Loudspeakers blaring gate changes, the clatter of rolling suitcases, the sharp tang of coffee and perfume hanging in the air. Other dogs might have been distracted by a dropped cookie crumbling on the floor, a child's squeal, or the rustle of stray bags abandoned in haste. But Bruno seemed programmed to analyze one target alone, his world shrinking to the man in the blue uniform, every other scent and sound fading into static. Ethan marveled at it, the way Bruno could tune out chaos and lock on to truth. It was why he'd chosen him, why he'd fought to keep him when others had written him off. "Cole," Natalie said quietly beside him, her voice low enough to stay between them. "If we find nothing, you'll be writing a report longer than a novel. The airline's already buzzing my earpiece." Ethan nodded slightly, his jaw tight. "I can write faster than I can watch bodies wash up at sea." Neither said more. Bruno led the way, like a living compass, guiding them through the terminal's maze toward a tipping point no one at the airport yet suspected. Behind that pressed uniform might lurk a nightmare waiting to strike, a shadow cast long and dark across the snow-covered runways. Ethan felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders, but with Bruno at his side, it was a weight he could carry. The secondary screening room, known as Security Room 2, was tucked deep in Terminal 5's administrative wing, a sterile box far from the passenger chaos. White walls, cold to the touch. A metal table gleamed under harsh tube lighting, its surface reflecting the room's stark emptiness. No windows, no noise beyond the steady hum of the ceiling air conditioner, a monotonous drone that filled the silence like a heartbeat. Ethan stepped inside, the chill of the space seeping into his bones, a stark contrast to the crowded warmth of the concourse. Captain Ryan Maddox sat upright at the table, hands clasped on the frigid stainless steel, fingers interlaced tightly as if anchoring himself. His pilot uniform remained neat, save for a few fresh wrinkles on the sleeves from earlier scuffling, faint creases betraying the struggle. His face held a calm expression, a mask of composure Ethan recognized from years of reading people under pressure. But his foot tapped faintly under the table. An unconscious tick Ethan, standing in the corner, didn't miss. It was subtle, a rhythm too erratic to be casual, and it set Ethan's instincts humming. Bruno sat by the door, silent but not relaxed, eyes fixed on the middle-aged man ahead with the same intensity he'd shown outside. His ears twitched faintly, attuned to sounds Ethan couldn't hear, his body poised as if ready to spring at a moment's notice. Ethan watched him, noting the way his fur caught the light, the way his chest rose and fell with steady breaths. Bruno didn't fidget or pace like other dogs might. He waited, a hunter's patience, a soldier's discipline. TSA agent Sandra Liu had finished inspecting all carry-on luggage and personal items, her movements methodical as she laid out the results. She meticulously checked every document, pilot's license, ID cards with Maddox's photo staring back impassively, then moved to specialized gear, flipping through navigation charts and logbooks. The phone came last, a pristine, latest model iPhone, its sleek surface free of scratches or signs of tampering, a device that screamed routine professionalism. "Everything matches his file," Sandra said, voice even, her tone clipped with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "No unusual devices, no trace substances on handles or zippers. Clean as it gets." Ethan nodded, his expression neutral. He'd expected as much. Maddox wasn't an amateur. He wouldn't carry anything obvious in plain sight. But Bruno's reaction wasn't about the obvious. It was about what hid beneath, what scanners couldn't catch. Ethan's mind churned, piecing together the puzzle, trusting the dog's nose over the paper trail. Maddox adjusted his collar slightly, a small, deliberate motion that drew Ethan's eye. "I told you, nothing suspicious here except your dog's hunch. And let me guess, no explosives, no metal, no chemicals found." He leaned back, crossing his arms, a calculated show of confidence that didn't quite reach his eyes. Ethan saw the flicker there, a shadow of unease Maddox couldn't fully mask. The man was good, polished, rehearsed, but not perfect. "Maybe," he continued, his voice smoother now, as if settling into a role, "Bruno reacted because I gave my cat meds this morning, high-dose antibiotics. She's got an ear infection. I wrapped her in a towel, held her tight for a bit, long enough for the smell to stick to me." Sandra glanced at Ethan, her brows lifting slightly. "It's possible. Some antibiotics have compounds similar to ephedrine, pseudoephedrine derivatives mostly. There have been reports of canines misfiring on it, especially if the scent's fresh." Ethan didn't reply. He didn't need to. Bruno did. The dog stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, a ripple of muscle under fur. No growl, no charge. Just a quiet few steps closer to Maddox, each paw placed with purpose, a predator sizing up its mark. Ethan gripped the leash tightly, ready to intervene if needed. his thumb brushing the worn leather. But Bruno didn't overstep. He approached the table, stopped just to Maddox's left, and lifted his head, staring intently at the lapel area of the uniform jacket, his nose twitching faintly as he processed the air. Maddox shifted, barely. A motion so slight it'd go unnoticed by most. A fractional lean away, a tightening of his fingers, except by Bruno, whose ears flicked in response. Instantly, Bruno growled low, then barked once, loud and decisive, the sound bouncing off the bare walls like a gunshot. Ethan felt it in his chest, a jolt that sharpened his focus. Sandra flinched, her clipboard rattling faintly against the table. Maddox frowned, his calm cracking further. "What now?" he said, voice dropping half a tone, a hint of strain creeping in. "My collar's offending the dog?" Ethan dropped his neutral stance, stepping closer to Bruno, resting a hand on his back, feeling the taut muscle beneath. Bruno doesn't dislike anyone, but he knows a smell that shouldn't be there. His voice was steady, but inside his mind raced. Bruno's alerts were never random, never emotional. This was specific, targeted, a neon sign flashing in a language only Ethan could read. Bruno pawed the table leg lightly once, a sharp tap of claw on metal, then lifted his head, pointing at the left lapel with a gaze sharp as a blade. It was where the airline logo sat, a discreet stitched seam, seemingly normal, a detail Ethan had seen on countless uniforms. But now he looked closer, drawn by Bruno's focus. Not a tear, not a stain. Perfect stillness. A thread line tighter than the right side, showing no stretch despite the jacket being worn all morning. No give in the fabric where there should have been. Ethan's eyes narrowed, his breath catching as the anomaly registered. It wasn't natural. Not for a uniform that had seen hours of wear. Not for a seam that should have softened with movement. Bruno stepped back half a pace, then growled softly again. This time longer. The unverified alert signal Ethan had learned in training. A sound that meant, "I've got something, but I need you to confirm." Ethan's pulse quickened. He knew that growl, had heard it in drills and real-world sweeps, and it had never led him astray. Sandra looked at Ethan, puzzled, her pen hovering over her clipboard. "You want to check that part of the jacket?" Ethan nodded, his voice firm despite the storm in his chest. "I want the left lapel checked. The inner seam. Could be something hidden in the fabric." Maddox shot up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, his calm shattering into shards. "Are you kidding? This is a custom-tailored uniform, worth over $2,000. You're going to rip it apart because a dog missmelled cat meds?" His voice rose, a mix of incredulity and fury, but Ethan caught the tremble beneath it, a thread of panic he couldn't hide. Bruno stood still, watching Ethan, his eyes steady as stone. No more barks, but his gaze didn't waver for a second, locked on the lapel like a laser. Ethan felt the weight of that trust, the unspoken pact between them. Whatever Maddox said, whatever the room thought, Bruno knew, and Ethan knew Bruno. Ethan tightened his grip on the leash, his fingers digging into the leather. He knew every gaze, every doubt, every consequence was now on him. The security team's hesitation, Natalie's raised brow, Maddox's rising voice. It was a gamble, a leap off a cliff with no net below. But he wasn't afraid, not with Bruno beside him. Because in this cold white room, only one being harbored, no doubt at all. Bruno. And Ethan chose to trust him, as he always had, as he always would. The air in the screening room suddenly felt colder, though the heating system hummed steadily, its faint whir a constant undertone to the tension. Ethan exhaled, his breath visible for a moment in the chill, a reminder of the stakes pressing down on them all. Sandra Lou set her radio on the table with a soft clack, speaking slowly into the mic, her voice measured but edged with urgency. "Requesting tech team to bring a handheld X-ray scanner to screening room 2. Priority 1. Captain Ryan Maddox stepped back half a pace, hands rising slightly in a defensive reflex, his posture stiffening. "What are you doing? Stripping me down and scanning me right here? This isn't a hospital." His words carried a bite, but his eyes darted to the door. A flicker of unease Ethan clocked instantly. Ethan said nothing. He turned to Bruno, giving a hand signal. A subtle lift of 2 fingers Bruno knew from countless drills. The dog understood, backing off a step, but his eyes stayed on Maddox, still locked on the left lapel, as if afraid the evidence might vanish if he looked away. Ethan admired that focus, the way Bruno held his ground without flinching, a quiet strength that steadied him in the storm of doubt swirling around them. Less than 3 minutes later, a TSA technician wheeled in a cart with a portable X-ray scanner, a compact version used for quick scans of fabric, shoes, hats, or bags that couldn't be dismantled. Its sleek design a stark contrast to the room's utilitarian bleakness. The technician, a wiry man with a clipboard tucked under his arm, nodded to Sandra as he positioned the device, his movements brisk but careful. "We won't damage your jacket," Sandra said, keeping her tone gentle, a diplomat smoothing ruffled feathers. "We just need to scan the left seam to confirm if there's anything unusual." Maddox stood still, but his eyes flashed with anger, a storm brewing behind the calm he'd worn like a shield. "You'll answer to the pilots' union for this," he said, his voice low and hard, a threat laced with venom. "We will," Ethan spoke up, stepping forward, his tone flat but unyielding. "If we find nothing, we'll apologize personally, but if we do, you might never fly again." He met Maddox's gaze, holding it for a beat, letting the words sink in. It wasn't a bluff, it was a promise, backed by Bruno's certainty and his own resolve. Maddox didn't react, just clenched his jaw faintly, a muscle twitching in his cheek, a tell Ethan filed away. Silence blanketed the screening room as the X-ray scanner rolled in, its wheels whispering against the tile. A different silence from the earlier agitation, heavy, urgent, and utterly focused, the kind that settles before a storm breaks. Ethan felt it in his bones, a pressure building behind his ribs, but he kept his stance relaxed, one hand resting lightly on Bruno's head. The device sat on a small mobile stand, lightweight with a handle, a display screen mounted on the side like a portable ultrasound, its surface glowing faintly as it powered up. A faint blue light swept over the left lapel of Captain Maddox's jacket as he sat motionless, not out of cooperation, but defiance. His arms crossed tightly, his breathing shallow but controlled. Ethan watched, his own breath syncing with Bruno's, a rhythm that grounded him. "Careful on this edge here," Ethan said, pointing to the spot Bruno had flagged, his finger hovering over the seam where the thread pulled taut. He could still see it, the unnatural stiffness, the way it didn't match the rest of the jacket. And he trusted Bruno's nose to have caught what his eyes only suspected. TSA technician Martin Dorsey nodded, his gaze professional but tinged with curiosity, a spark of intrigue in his otherwise stoic demeanor. He adjusted the scan angle, upped the wavelength depth with a quick twist of a dial, then slowly moved the device across the fabric, his hands steady as a surgeon's. Ethan admired the precision, a mirror to Bruno's own methodical nature. At first, the screen showed only vague outlines of threads, lining, and button edges, fuzzy gray shapes dancing in a sea of black. All normal, predictable, the kind of image Ethan had seen in training vids a dozen times. But as the scanner passed over the left lapel, right at the seam that looked slightly thicker, the display lit up with an anomaly, a bright spot flaring against the dark like a star in the night sky. Martin froze, his hand pausing mid-motion. He pulled back, then returned to the same spot, scanning again, his brow furrowing as he leaned closer to the screen. Ethan's stomach tightened, a coil of anticipation winding tight. An ultra-thin object with electronic circuitry appeared beneath the fabric, its edges crisp against the scanner's glow. Rectangular, postage stamp size, but clearly not part of the jacket, a foreign shape nestled in the weave. Ethan's breath caught, his mind racing to catalog what it could be. "Zoom in there," he said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the room's stillness. Martin tapped a quick key combo, his fingers deft on the controls. The screen brightened, the image sharpening until fine copper lines emerged, linked in a sophisticated electronic pattern. A web of precision etched into the tiny frame. Circuits ran along a flat object, no bulk, no protrusions, but capable of signaling, a whisper of intent hidden in silence. Ethan stared, his pulse thudding in his ears. "Not an ID chip, not a magnetic tag," Martin muttered, his voice a mix of awe and unease as he traced the lines with his eyes. It's some kind of micro-trigger or controller. Could be a detonator or maybe an ultra-small sensor component. I've never seen anything this compact outside a lab. Sandra swallowed, her clipboard slipping slightly in her grip. "It's hidden in the stitching?" "Yes," Martin confirmed, nodding as he adjusted the scanner for a clearer angle. Between the inner lining and outer fabric, affixed like a patch, hand-sewn shut. From the outside, it's nearly undetectable, but on this X-ray, it's clear as day, lit up like a beacon. Bruno, still sitting quietly in the corner, suddenly stood, his movement a ripple of purpose. He stepped forward, approached Maddox's jacket where it lay draped over the table's edge, lifted his head to the exact spot, and growled low, a deep, drawn-out sound that vibrated through the room. Ethan recognized it, not an alarm reaction, but a confirmation growl, a quiet declaration. I was right. Bruno's certainty was an anchor, a lifeline in the chaos of discovery. Ethan nodded, eyes glued to the device on the screen, the pieces in his mind clicking together like a lock sliding into place. Circuitry, placement, Bruno's reaction from the start, Maddox's overreaction. It all made sense now, a puzzle solved by a dog's nose in a handler's faith. He felt a surge of pride, a quiet triumph that steadied his hands. "Captain Maddox," Sandra said, her politeness almost strained, a tightrope walk between protocol and disbelief. "Do you have an explanation for the device hidden in your flight uniform?" Maddox didn't answer immediately. His silence stretched, heavy and deliberate, a wall going up brick by brick. Instead, he braced both hands on the table, leaned forward, his gaze piercing Martin, who still stood by the scanner, frozen mid-motion. The air thickened, the room shrinking under the weight of his stare. "I want to speak to a lawyer," Maddox said, voice hardening, each word a stone dropped into still water. "And I want a record of every step you've taken today. I'm not answering more questions." "That's your right," Sandra replied, her tone clipped but calm, though her hand tightened slightly on the radio at her hip, a subtle tell of her unease. Ethan edged half a step closer, his body angled toward Maddox, ready for anything. At that moment, Bruno lunged forward, body rigid, nose aimed at Maddox like an arrow, his growl shifting to a sharper pitch. Ethan's heart leapt. He knew that sound, had trained for it, lived it. One beat. Maddox yanked his hand off the table, bringing it to his mouth fast. Too smooth to be unintentional, a blur of motion that screamed intent. Ethan saw the glint of something white between his fingers. A capsule, and instinct took over. "Stop!" Ethan shouted, his voice a crack of thunder in the small room. Bruno sprang instantly, his sturdy frame covering the distance in a single bound, claws skidding on the steel floor with a grating screech. Ethan dove, slamming his hand into Maddox's elbow with a force that jarred his own arm, knocking the white capsule from his grasp just before it reached his mouth. It hit the floor with a faint clatter, rolling under the table. A tiny harbinger of death stopped in its tracks. "Poison!" Sandra yelled, her voice rising in pitch, her clipboard clattering to the floor as she lunged for her radio. "He tried to kill himself!" Bruno roared fiercely, a sound that shook the walls, clawing the floor as if shielding Maddox from the pill, his body a barrier of fur and fury. Ethan felt the vibration through his boots, a primal force unleashed. Martin kicked his chair back, fumbling for gloves with shaking hands, his clipboard skittering across the table. Ethan pinned Maddox down fast, one hand clamping his jaw with bruising force, the other gripping his collar, forcing his head back to keep his mouth open. Maddox's teeth gnashed at the air, a desperate snap, his face flushing red from lack of oxygen, veins bulging at his temples. Ethan held firm, his muscles straining, adrenaline flooding his system like fire. Maddox thrashed, his body a coil of resistance, teeth snapping inches from Ethan's fingers, face contorted in a mask of rage and fear. A backup security officer burst in from the hall, a blur of dark uniform, helping Ethan subdue him. Maddox now foaming slightly at the mouth, though the pill hadn't fully dissolved, its bitter scent faint in the air. Sandra slammed her radio against her palm, her voice sharp with panic. "Call internal medical emergency. Subject attempted suicide with a poison capsule." Less than 90 seconds later, the med team stormed in, a whirlwind of white coats and clattering gear. Maddox got an emergency injection, needle flashing in the harsh light, and was strapped to a stretcher, his wrist twisting against the restraints. The poison pill, still wet with saliva, was scooped into an evidence bag by a gloved hand, its surface glistening ominously as it disappeared into plastic. Before leaving, a nurse, young, wide-eyed, turned to Ethan, her voice steady despite the chaos. "He'll live, but he'll be out for hours." The door shut behind them with a heavy thud, sealing the room in sudden stillness. A faint antiseptic smell lingered, sharp and sterile, cutting through the tension like a blade. Ethan exhaled, his breath ragged, his hands trembling faintly as the adrenaline ebbed. Bruno returned to Ethan's side, breathing steady but eyes still taut as bowstrings, locked on the spot where Maddox had been. Ethan knelt, placing a hand on Bruno's chest, feeling the rapid thud of his heart beneath thick fur, meeting those deep brown eyes that held no trace of doubt. "Without you, he'd have boarded. No one could have stopped it." Then he whispered, "Just for Bruno," his voice rough with emotion. "We just stopped something huge." Bruno didn't react. He simply sat, gaze shifting to the jacket still on the table, a silent sentinel guarding the truth they'd uncovered together. Ethan rested his forehead against Bruno's for a moment, a rare gesture, drawing strength from the dog's calm. Whatever this was, it wasn't over, but they'd won this round. 3 hours after the emergency escort from the screening room, the name Ryan Maddox vanished from O'Hare's security system, erased like a ghost fading into mist. The terminal hummed on, oblivious, but in the command hub, the air crackled with urgency. Identity verification from the National Interagency Data Center arrived with a red-level priority, extreme urgency, a digital stamp that pulsed like a warning light. When Ethan received the thick printed file dropped onto the desk in the temporary command room, its weight thudded against the wood. Everything snapped into focus and became exponentially more dangerous. He flipped it open, the pages crisp and cold under his fingers, each line a revelation that tightened his chest. Ryan Maddox, veteran pilot, valid flight credentials, pristine training record, didn't exist in the FAA's international database 3 years prior. The name was a shell, a mask stitched together with precision. Instead, facial scans from hallway cameras matched 99.8% to another name, Lucas Aaron Drexler, U.S. Citizen, born 1980, former pilot for a small private airline, who vanished from security oversight at Frankfurt International Airport, Germany, in late 2022. Ethan stared at the photo, a younger Drexler, leaner, with a different haircut but the same hard eyes, feeling the ground shift beneath him. At that point, Drexler had been on Interpol's watch list, linked to an underground group called Obsidian, an extremist network using high-tech for large-scale international terror plots, a name that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He'd heard whispers of Obsidian in briefings, shadowy, elusive, a specter that haunted security circles, but never this close, never this real. "Damn it," Natalie Brooks, airport security supervisor, muttered, eyeing the file over Ethan's shoulder, her voice a low hiss. "We just detained someone who topped 5 countries' watch lists." Ethan stayed silent, his jaw tight as he flipped through page after page. Photos of Lucas in an old pilot uniform, grainy stills from European airport cameras, abruptly halted tracking reports that left more questions than answers, and a terse final note like a knife's edge. Lost surveillance signal, November 2022. Presumed dead. The words stared back at him, mocking in their simplicity. He didn't die, Ethan said, shaking his head slightly, his voice rough with realization. He just changed skins and came back with a bigger plan. Bruno lay at his feet, quiet, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes staying wide, ever watchful, missing no one entering or leaving the room. Ethan glanced down, drawing comfort from the dog's presence, a steady anchor in the storm of information crashing over them. Bruno didn't need to read the file. He'd known from the first sniff, from the moment he'd stopped Maddox in his tracks. Forensic techs finished unsewing the lapel stitching in the evidence lab, their gloved hands moving with surgical precision under bright lights. The device, stored in a magnetic shielded box, was an ultra-thin electronic piece, SIM card size, with copper circuits and a low-frequency wave sensor, its surface gleaming faintly like a secret unearthed. Ethan stood behind the glass, watching, his breath fogging briefly against the pane. Initial analysis showed it wasn't a listening device. It didn't transmit data. It didn't receive signals. It sent them. A remote trigger, small enough to hide in plain sight, powerful enough to start a chain reaction. Ethan's stomach twisted as the implications sank in. This type is designed to send a short-range electrical pulse, strong enough to wake or detonate a pre-placed device waiting for a command, the expert said, a wiry man with glasses perched on his nose, tapping the circuit diagram on screen with a stylus. His voice was calm, clinical, but Ethan caught the undercurrent of awe. "You're sure?" Ethan asked, his arms crossed, his tone steady but edged with urgency. "Positive," the expert replied, adjusting his glasses. "This isn't commercial tech. Hand-soldered circuits, bonded with microconductive adhesive, only doable by hand or in a semi-military lab. Whoever made this knew exactly what they were doing. Precision work, covert, high stakes." Ethan peered through the glass at Maddox, or rather Drexler, still unconscious in the airport medbay, wrists cuffed tightly to the bed frame, his chest rising and falling under a thin blanket. An armed guard stood at the door, rifle slung across his chest, a silent sentinel in the dim light. Ethan's mind raced. What had Drexler planned? What was the pulse meant to wake? "What's waiting to be triggered?" Natalie asked, voice low as if no one else should hear, her arms crossed tightly over her vest. "We need to check the plane he was set to fly," Ethan replied, almost instinctively, his words spilling out before he'd fully processed them. "If this is the trigger, the receiver could be in the cockpit or somewhere on the aircraft itself. We can't assume it's isolated." Bruno rose, lifting his head from his front paws, his ears twitching as if he'd heard the unspoken command. Ethan leaned down, whispering, "What do you think, boy? Could it already be planted?" Bruno barked once, short and sharp, a sound that cut through the room's hum. Ethan understood, a chill racing down his spine. Bruno didn't guess. He knew. Nothing was random about Drexler, a man off the grid for 3 years, returning with a flawless fake identity, valid flight papers, at a snow-choked airport with impatient passengers and rushed security checks. Ethan pictured it, the chaos of the storm, the shortened protocols, the perfect window for something to slip through. And it had, until Bruno stopped it. And if not for Bruno, Ethan shuddered at the thought of a signal device hidden in a pilot's jacket, activating something mid-flight, at 35,000 feet over the ocean, with no help, no way back, just a metal tube plummeting into darkness. His hands clenched into fists, nails digging into his palms as the image took hold. He glanced down at Bruno, meeting the dog's calm gaze. But in those eyes, Ethan saw it. Bruno had sensed this from the first moment, from that initial growl in the terminal. It wasn't just a hunch, it was a warning, delivered in silence and sealed with action. "We've got to get to the plane," Ethan said, standing, his voice cutting through the room's haze. "Now!" Bruno nodded slightly, human-like, a faint tilt of his head that Ethan had come to recognize as agreement. And this time no one argued. Not Natalie, not the techs, not the guard glancing over from the door. They all felt it, the urgency, the stakes, the truth Bruno had unearthed. The Boeing 777 flight AA2184 sat still on an auxiliary runway in the maintenance zone, its silver bulk a silent giant against the snowy night. Wind whistled softly through its vents, a faint hiss beneath the fuselage, as if the plane itself held a secret only time could force out, its engines cold and dark under the storm's weight. Ethan approached, his boots crunching through fresh snow, the cold biting at his face as he scanned the aircraft's outline. But Bruno didn't need time. He just needed scent. An evacuation order had been issued shortly after the lapel device was confirmed as a wireless detonator, a decision that had cleared the area in a flurry of shouts and flashing lights. All passengers were gone, shuffled to holding areas with murmured apologies. The crew separated for questioning in a makeshift office nearby. Now, only the specialized tech team remained. Ethan, Carlos, an explosives expert with a weathered face and steady hands, and Bruno, boarding the aircraft through a jetway dusted with snow. Ethan glanced at his dog as they stepped through the main door into the passenger cabin, the interior dim and eerily quiet. Seats empty and overhead, bins gaping open. Bruno's ears were up, his body taut, a coiled spring ready to move. Ethan felt a swell of trust, a quiet confidence that had grown with every step they'd taken together. Bruno moved a step ahead, unhurried but intensely focused, his nose already working the air. Unlike typical canines that might eagerly sniff everywhere, paws skittering, tails wagging in a frenzy, Bruno scanned scents like an algorithm, methodical and precise. Left to right, floor to ceiling, he swept the cabin with a calm that belied the stakes, pausing only when something warranted closer scrutiny. Ethan followed, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows, his breath fogging faintly in the unheated space. "You sure he'll pick it up if there's anything?" Carlos asked quietly, hands gripping a magnetic scanner, his voice rough from years of shouting over machinery. "He doesn't miss," Ethan replied, eyes on Bruno, his tone carrying the weight of experience. He'd seen Bruno work miracles, small ones, quiet ones, that no one else noticed until it was too late to deny. Carlos nodded, unconvinced but willing to trust, his scanner humming faintly in his grip. Bruno paused briefly mid-cabin, near the business class seats, sniffing a forgotten carry-on, a black duffel slumped against a leg rest. He inhaled once lightly, his nose twitching, then moved on, as if certain it wasn't the target, dismissing it with a flick of his head. Ethan recognized the gesture, a silent "not this" that had guided them through countless sweeps. "Not interested," Ethan said, almost chuckling at the familiar cue, a moment of levity in the tension. Carlos nodded, still marveling at how this dog worked, his skepticism softening into curiosity as he watched Bruno's deliberate pace. Near the cockpit door, Bruno's demeanor shifted, not abruptly, subtly, like a shadow lengthening at dusk. He stopped fully, silent for a few seconds, then lowered his head to the floor, his nose brushing the carpeted surface. Legs bent slightly, tail down, his body sank into a hunting stance. Not for attack, but for tracking, a predator zeroing in on prey. Ethan's pulse quickened, his flashlight steady as he watched. "Bruno," Ethan called softly, his voice a whisper in the stillness, a lifeline between them. No reply, none needed. Bruno took 2 more steps, closing in on the co-pilot's seat, normally the first officer's spot, its leather worn but intact. He sniffed along the seat's base, his nose tracing the frame, then reared up, planting his front paws on the cushion with a soft thud. tilting his head as if sensing something invisible, something buried deep. Then a low growl rumbled out, deep and even, lasting exactly 2 seconds. A sound Ethan felt in his chest like a warning bell. Ethan's spine chilled, a shiver racing up his back as he stepped closer. He knew that growl, had heard it in moments that changed everything. Carlos dropped low, running the magnetic scanner lightly over the seat frame, his movements quick but careful. The device's hum a faint counterpoint to Bruno's growl. "I've got an anomaly here," he said, voice tight as a wire, his eyes flicking to the scanner's display. "Not standard wiring. This has a fluctuating pulse, irregular, like it's active." Bruno pawed the seat's underside lightly, his claws catching faintly on the fabric, then turned to Ethan, meeting his gaze. A confirming look, steady and sure, no doubt left, no hesitation. Ethan nodded back, a silent pact sealed in that glance. "Call the interior disassembly team," Carlos said into his radio, his thumb pressing the button hard enough to whiten his knuckle. "Need to open the seat casing, right where Bruno marked." Less than 2 minutes later, a technician arrived, a burly man with a tool bag slung over his shoulder, his breath fogging as he stepped into the cold cockpit. No one spoke, the air thick with unspoken tension. Every sound, the clink of tools, the rustle of fabric, swallowed by a silence heavy as fog. Ethan stood back, giving room but staying close, his hand resting on Bruno's neck, feeling the dog's warmth against his palm. The seat came apart, screws clattering into a tray, fabric peeled back with a soft rip. And when the bottom lining was removed, there, pressed against the steel frame, was a small silver box, about 12 centimeters long. No labels, no lights, no buttons, no wires. Its surface smooth and cold under the flashlight's beam. Ethan's breath hitched, his eyes narrowing as he leaned in. But as Carlos brought the sensor closer, the box emitted a faint electrical pulse, just enough to show live circuitry inside, awaiting a command, a heartbeat in the silence. Ethan felt the weight of it, the quiet menace of a thing so small yet so deadly. "God Almighty," Carlos whispered, his voice barely audible, a prayer more than a curse. "We're looking at a remote-triggered explosive, likely directional or controlled destruction type. This isn't amateur work." Ethan leaned in, inspecting it, his flashlight casting stark shadows across the device. It was secured with industrial insulating adhesive, positioned to rupture the flight control systems beneath the cockpit floor if detonated at the right moment. A surgical strike hidden in plain sight. His mind raced, picturing the damage, the chaos, the lives snuffed out in an instant. Carlos continued, voice firm now, his shock hardening into resolve. "If this went off at cruising altitude, 10,000 meters, 900 km/h, it'd shred the hydraulics and main control lines. Pilots would lose control in 3 to 7 seconds. No way to recover, not a chance." Silence fell, thick and heavy, the cockpit a tomb of realization. Ethan's hand tightened on Bruno's fur, grounding himself in the dog's steady presence. Bruno stood there, no barking, no tail wagging, his body still as stone. He just sat, eyes on the device, like a warrior who'd just sniffed out the biggest threat he'd ever faced. His mission complete, but his vigilance unbroken. Ethan felt a swell of gratitude, a quiet awe at the dog's precision. Ethan rested a hand on Bruno's head, his voice soft but steady. "You did great, boy. Better than great." No one in the team laughed. No one clapped. The technician wiped sweat from his brow despite the cold. Carlos stared at the box like it might bite, and the radio crackled faintly with updates from outside. But each of them looked at Bruno, and in their eyes was absolute recognition. No machine, no security software had caught this bomb. No human eye had seen it. No protocol had flagged it. Only Bruno, with his nose and his nerve, had pierced the veil. And because of him, 243 people didn't plummet into the ocean, their lives preserved by a dog who'd never know the weight of his own heroism. Ethan knelt beside him, pressing his forehead to Bruno's again. A silent thank you for a victory no words could capture. Room 4, Special Recovery Unit, O'Hare Airport Internal Medical Station. Lucas Drexler woke under the blinding white of ceiling lights, the harsh glow bleaching the room into stark relief. His eyes blinked a few times, pupils contracting against the glare. A faint groan escaping his lips as awareness crept back. An IV line ran from his left wrist to a hanging drip, the needle taped sloppily against his skin. Both wrists were cuffed to the bed rails with unyielding steel, one side slightly bloodied from when he'd yanked in his stupor, a smear of red against the pale sheets. Ethan watched from the doorway, noting the slow rise of Drexler's chest, the way his fingers twitched faintly as he came to. 2 agents stood guard inside, their presence a wall of quiet menace. One silently manned the door, his hand resting near his holster, eyes scanning the room like a machine. The other watched Drexler's every breath as if lies could be read in the rhythm of his chest, his stance rigid but alert. Ethan felt the tension radiating from them, a coiled readiness he'd seen in men who'd faced worse than this. Ethan Cole, Natalie Brooks, and federal agent Jason Monroe entered when the doctor, a harried woman with gray-streaked hair, confirmed he's lucid enough for contact, her clipboard clutched like a shield. Bruno didn't join, a decision Ethan resented but couldn't fight. He was outside with another K-9 officer, pacing the hall in his vest, his absence a gap Ethan felt keenly. Though Ethan wanted Bruno there, for a sort of face-to-face, a final stand, he knew the rules. No dogs in formal interrogations, no matter how much they'd earned it. Lucas glanced at each of them as they filed in, his gaze unnervingly alert. No delirium, no panic, no anger, just a cold clarity that set Ethan's nerves on edge. His face was pale but composed, the mask of Maddox slipping away to reveal something harder, older, more dangerous. "Good evening," he said, voice hoarse but clear, a faint rasp from the poison's aftermath. "I assume you found the device." Ethan didn't reply, his jaw tight as he studied the man. Monroe set an evidence bag on the side table with a deliberate thud, the trigger from his jacket, its circuits glinting through the plastic, resting beside a printed Boeing 777 schematic. The cockpit marked in red, a bloody X on the co-pilot's seat. The sight of it twisted Ethan's gut, a reminder of how close they'd come. "You nearly killed 243 people, Natalie said, her voice toneless, her arms crossed tightly as she stood near the foot of the bed. "And if not for that dog," Lucas cut in, voice eerily calm, a thread of steel beneath the rasp. "I didn't nearly kill anyone. I was tasked with a test run. Flight AA21184 was just a real-world condition check, a dry run, nothing more. If I wasn't caught, the signal would have gone to the organization, and they'd proceed with the next steps. That's how it works." Monroe narrowed his eyes, stepping closer, his shadow falling across the bed. "What organization?" Lucas breathed slowly, as if choosing his words with care, each one weighed and measured. "Obsidian," he said, the name dropping like a stone into still water, rippling through the room. "A stateless network, no flag, no political ideology. Just one goal, proving global security is an illusion, and tech can be weaponized to shatter humanity's trust in the system." Ethan clenched his fist, nails digging into his palm, the name echoing in his head. Obsidian, he'd heard it in hushed tones, a ghost story swapped over coffee and late-night briefings. But now it was real, flesh and blood, and handcuffs. "And what are you in that network?" Ethan asked, his voice low, steady despite the anger simmering beneath. Lucas turned his head, eyes deep as the ocean floor, meeting Ethan's gaze with a look that pierced through him. "I'm the opener," he said, the words simple but heavy, a title that carried more weight than Ethan could yet grasp. Monroe stepped closer, voice urgent now, his notepad forgotten in his hand. "How many more are planned? Who's involved?" You didn't act alone. Give us something. Lucas smiled faintly, a joyless smirk, cold and calculated, his lips barely moving. You don't have time for a trace game. Obsidian runs on a cell model, compartmentalized, blind. I don't know real names, just code names. But I know this. 2 other pilots, Frankfurt and Paris, they're set to run the same playbook as me within 36 to 48 hours from now. Ethan edged closer to the bed, his boots scuffing the tile, his mind racing. Are they already on planes? Maybe, Lucas replied, his tone maddeningly even. Or in standby, waiting for clearance. If I didn't signal success, 3 outcomes. 1, they proceed without confirmation, full steam ahead. 2, they pull back, vanish into the ether. 3, they switch to a plan B. I wasn't briefed on. Your guess is as good as mine. Natalie turned to Monroe instantly, her voice sharp. We need Interpol, 2 airports, Frankfurt and Charles de Gaulle. Now. Already on it, Monroe said fast, his hand brushing his radio. Started when his real ID came through an hour ago. But if those 2 are embedded in flight crews, we need to ground every plane they're assigned to before takeoff. No exceptions. Ethan faced Lucas again, leaning in, his shadow falling across the man's face. Why planes? Why not trains or a mall? Something easier, less guarded? Lucas closed his eyes for a few seconds, as if lost in a creed only he grasped, his breath slow and deliberate. When he opened them, his gaze was distant, almost reverent. Because planes, he whispered, are the ultimate symbol of human trust. You step into a metal tube, lock the door, sit still, believing the stranger up front, someone you've never met, will lift you into the sky and bring you back. Break that, and you break the world's order. That's the point. That's the mission. No one spoke further, the room falling into a stunned silence, his words hanging like smoke. Ethan stepped back, gazed steely, his mind churning with the implications. He didn't need more questions, because he knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. And Bruno, who'd sniffed out the start, would be the only one sharp enough to track the rest, the only one who could cut through the lies and the tech and the chaos to find the next thread. Ethan felt it in his gut. They were just scratching the surface of something vast, something that stretched across oceans and borders, a web with Drexler as its first caught fly. 4:17 a.m. Just hours after Lucas Drexler revealed the next piece of the conspiracy puzzle, a rapid response team of TSA, FBI, and O'Hare K-9s stood ready outside a 17-story apartment building in South Chicago. An address Lucas had muttered in a half-conscious state as the sedative wore off. Apartment 4B, Lakeside Towers. Don't let it erase the trail. Ethan replayed the words in his head, the urgency of them driving him forward through the snow-dusted streets. Ethan Cole checked Bruno's leash, adjusted his bulletproof vest with careful hands, then crouched, whispering into the dog's ear, his breath fogging in the night air. Only you can find what we can't see. Like always, boy. Bruno stood still, barely reacting, his body a silhouette against the building's sodium-lit facade. But his ears tilted faintly toward the entrance, as if he'd started gathering data before the van even stopped, his senses already peeling back the layers of the night. Ethan felt a surge of pride, a quiet marvel at the dog's readiness, a partner who never faltered. Inside the 4th-floor hallway was deathly quiet, a stark contrast to the wind howling outside. Ceiling lights flickered in bursts, casting jagged shadows across the walls. The damp smell of old carpet mingling with leftover dinner odors, grease and onions, still hanging in the air from some tenant's late meal. Ethan's boots sank slightly into the worn pile, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom as the team moved in. The task force fanned out, maintaining absolute silence, their movements a choreography of trained precision, hand signals, soft steps, weapons held low but ready. Ethan stayed near the center, Bruno at his side. the dog's presence a steady pulse in the tension. Apartment 4B's door looked unremarkable. Electronic lock, doorbell camera with a dull lens. No signs of tampering, just another unit in a sea of anonymity. But Ethan saw Bruno halt a meter away, head low, nose to the floor, his body tensing like a bowstring. In seconds, he whined softly in his throat, a telltale reaction when Bruno caught a strange chemical scent or a human odor inconsistent with memorized data. A sound Ethan knew like his own heartbeat. Ethan nodded slightly to the SWAT team leader, a stocky man with a scar across his jaw, his eyes sharp under a tactical cap. Signal confirmed. Breach. Quietly. The door was opened with a specialized electronic lock breaker, a slim device that hummed faintly as it worked. No explosion, no smash, just a faint click, and the team flowed in like spreading shadows, their boots whispering against the hardwood inside. Ethan followed, Bruno at his left, the dog's nose already working the air, his ears twitching with every sound. Bruno led the left flank, needing no cue, his movements pinpoint precise, a hunter on a trail only he could see. He spiraled from the living room, bare with a single couch and a muted TV, then circled through the kitchen where everything was eerily neat, dishes stacked, counters wiped, a sterile order that felt wrong. Ethan's flashlight swept the space, catching glints off the stainless steel, his gut tightening at the stillness. No one was in the apartment, the silence thick and oppressive, a void where life should have been. But a small bedroom inside was fortified with a steel door, a slab of gray metal, a design never meant for civilian homes, its edges sealed tight. Ethan's pulse quickened, his hand brushing Bruno's back as they approached. "This room's off," an officer said, edging closer cautiously, his rifle angled low, his voice a hushed rasp. Ethan stood beside Bruno, hand ready on the leash, his fingers tight against the leather. Bruno pawed lightly at the door's gap, his claws scraping faintly, then looked up at Ethan, eyes wide, brighter than usual under the flashlight's beam, a gleam of certainty in their depths. Ethan felt it, a jolt of recognition, a silent command from his partner. "Breach it," Ethan said, his voice firm, cutting through the stillness. "Something's waiting behind there." The hinge strikes echoed, a sharp clang that bounced off the walls, the sound jarring in the quiet. The door gave way after 3 hard blows, metal groaning as it swung open. The room beyond emerged, a makeshift command hub, small but intricately organized, a nerve center hidden in plain sight, a desk with 3 mounted screens, their glow casting eerie shadows, a humming mini-server rig, its fans a low drone in the silence, a large wall map, O'Hare's detailed internal layout, gates and checkpoints marked in red, and scattered on the desk, technical schematics of electronic devices, handwritten notes in German and French, ink smudged but legible, a blueprint of intent. Ethan stepped inside, his boots thudding softly on the bare floor, his flashlight sweeping the space. Bruno didn't stop there, his focus unbroken, his nose driving him forward. He marched straight to a filing cabinet against the wall, a dented metal box that looked out of place amid the tech, sniffing each drawer with deliberate care. One seemed unlocked, its handle loose, but Bruno growled and clawed relentlessly at the wood. A rare move reserved for detecting digital scents like circuits, memory chips, or unshielded drives, a signal Ethan knew meant dig deeper. Ethan slid the drawer open, his fingers brushing cold steel, the faint creak of metal filling the room. Inside, a black portable hard drive, unlabeled, wrapped in an anti-static bag, its surface matte and unassuming. Alongside it, a printed pilot list, 17 names typed in stark black, some crossed out with red slashes, others marked in progress in a hasty scrawl. Ethan's breath caught, his mind racing as he lifted the drive, its weight heavier than it should have been. Carlos, who just arrived, his boots scuffing the threshold, plugged the drive into a secure portable reader, his hands steady despite the tension. The screen flared to life, a folder popping up in bold letters. Ascend. Phase 2. Primary targets. Ethan leaned in, his shadow falling across the desk, his pulse thudding in his ears. Security maps of European airports, Carlos whispered, scrolling fast, his finger trembling faintly on the trackpad. ID checkpoint layouts, hallway camera blind spots, internal flight schedules, and a list of electronics, identical to what you found, Bruno. Same design, same specs. Bruno sat silent, but his eyes stayed on the drive, a steady gaze that held no triumph, only readiness. As if awaiting the next command, though he'd led them to this, a discovery that cracked the case wide open. Ethan felt a swell of awe, a quiet reverence for the dog's instinct. Ethan rested a hand on Bruno's head, his voice low but firm. You just uncovered layer 2 of this plan, boy. No machine, no human would have found it without you. Outside the hall, techs began sealing the scene, their voices a murmur through the walls, evidence bags rustling as they worked. On the server screen, an unopened alert still blinked, its red text pulsing like a heartbeat. Pending activation, secondary trigger T40, we're not 12:33. The countdown had started before they arrived, a ticking clock Ethan could feel in his bones. And now, the race against time wasn't in the interrogation room anymore. It was out there, where others were poised to finish what Lucas couldn't, a web stretching across continents, its strands still hidden in shadow. Ethan looked at Bruno, the dog's calm grounding him, and knew they'd only just begun. K9 Unit Office, O'Hare International Airport. On the wall hung a small honor board displaying photos of standout service dogs from the past decade, their frames weathered but proud. Below each, a name, badge number, and log successes, explosives detected, suspicious luggage found, border breaches stopped, arrests aided, etched in brass plates dulled by time. Most were German Shepherds or Belgian Malinois, breeds prized for quick reflexes, sharp instincts, and near-perfect obedience, their glossy coats and fierce gazes staring out from the black and white prints. Ethan had walked past it 1,000 times, his eyes skimming the names. But today it felt different. Bruno wasn't up there. Not yet. He wasn't the warrior type honored straight out of the gate, the kind that bounded into fame with bared teeth and blazing speed. Not the dog acing standard test with a handler's shout and a crowd's cheer. As a rookie, Bruno had even been cut from 2 federal training courses, a fact that still stung Ethan when he thought about it, for a reason both laughable and bitter. Slow response, pauses too long before scent confirmation, overanalyzes unnecessarily. The words had been scrawled in a trainer's report, a dismissal that had nearly ended Bruno's career before it began. Ethan kept that report in a drawer, a reminder of how close he'd come to losing the best partner he'd ever have. At the K9 Training Center in Texas, where Ethan first met Bruno, the instructor, a grizzled man with a buzz cut and a permanent scowl, had skimmed his file and said curtly, his voice rough as gravel, "This guy's a thinker, not suited for high-speed tasks. Take him if you want, but I'd pick another. There are dogs twice as fast, twice as eager, but Ethan, never one for standard reflexes, a trait that had earned him his own share of sideways looks, stood watching Bruno for a while, ignoring the instructor's impatience. While other dogs in the training yard chased balls and snapped to commands with relentless energy, barking and bounding in a frenzy of motion, Bruno sat still, head tilted, eyes tracking. Not the ball, but the trainer's hand, the subtle flick of a wrist, the shift of weight from one foot to the other, as if asking, why throw it that way? What are you testing me for? What's the point? Something in that stillness caught Ethan's eye, a quiet instinct that spoke louder than the chaos around them. He saw a dog who didn't just react, who thought, who questioned, who saw beyond the surface. It wasn't what the program wanted, but it was what Ethan needed. He'd signed the papers that day, taking Bruno against advice, a decision that felt like a gamble but landed like fate. And in those first weeks, regret wasn't rare. Bruno didn't react instantly to odd scents, his nose lingering too long for the timers ticking in drills. He didn't charge at urgent signals, his paws planted while others raced ahead. He paused, verified, cross-checked, earning Ethan deduction after deduction in coordination exercises. The instructor's red pens slashing through his scores. Ethan had cursed under his breath more than once, wondering if he'd made a mistake, if Bruno was too slow for the job. Until one time, in a simulated warehouse exercise, a sprawling maze of crates and shadows designed to test reaction under pressure, every K9 hit on a preset scent trap, a decoy planted to test false positives, their barks echoing as handlers shouted corrections. Only Bruno stopped at a forgotten wooden box in a shadowed corner, its surface scuffed and unremarkable, overlooked by the team. Inside was a mini electronic device laced with nitrate, a tech's oversight, a mistake meant to stay hidden. Only Bruno caught it, sitting silently until Ethan noticed, his nose unwavering. Not from reflex, but from analyzing a scent out of place, out of time, a detail no one else had seen. After that day, Ethan never doubted Bruno again. He learned to work with a dog who didn't need speed, but near-perfect precision, a partner who didn't chase glory, but found truth. That moment shifted everything. Ethan stopped fighting Bruno's pace and started trusting it, a lesson that carried them through years of quiet victories to this. And now as Ethan watched Bruno resting under the desk, ears still perked toward the door despite the late hour, eyes half closed as if napping but never fully off guard, he felt something strange in his chest. Pride, but more, gratitude, deep and unshakable. Bruno wasn't just a dog anymore, not just a tool or a partner. He was a lifeline, a compass in a world that too often lost its way. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the creak of old springs loud in the quiet office, his gaze lingering on the black and tan shepherd who turned a routine patrol into a legend. He hadn't just saved the passengers of AA2184. He'd saved Ethan from mistakes that could have cost lives, from doubts that gnawed at his edges, from the creeping fear of ignoring instinct when the system said all clear, but the air felt wrong. Ethan rubbed his jaw, the stubble rough under his fingers, and thought of how close they'd come, how one bark had shifted the tide. Bruno didn't know the headlines or the medals. He didn't need to. He just did what he was born to, what Ethan had learned to trust. The federal investigation team had called Bruno the most accurate security tool the U.S. system has ever had. A quote picked up by a news channel the next morning, blasted across screens as papers ran headlines. K9 dog saves 243 lives. The story of Bruno, the dog nearly cut from the force. Ethan had seen the clips. The grainy footage of Bruno blocking Maddox replayed in slow motion, the anchor's voice swelling with awe. But to Ethan, it was simpler, truer. He wasn't cut. He just waited for the right moment to prove he's never wrong. That was Bruno, patient, precise, a quiet force that struck when it mattered most. Bruno sighed softly, opening his eyes to look at Ethan, his gaze steady and calm, a faint gleam in the dim light. "Know you're about to be famous yet?" Ethan asked, leaning down to pat his back, his hands sinking into the thick fur. "People are waiting out there. They want to give you a medal, live TV and all, cameras, lights, the works." Bruno just blinked, lifted his head a bit, then settled back down, his muzzle resting on his paws. He didn't care about recognition, didn't perk up at the promise of applause. He just did his job, like every day, every patrol, every sweep through the terminal's endless corridors. Quietly, precisely, relentlessly. And because of that, hundreds could keep flying, keep living, keep trusting the sky wouldn't betray them. 3 weeks after thwarting Flight AA2184, in a large hall at the Midwest Regional Homeland Security Headquarters, 2 special figures were called on stage to receive the highest honor A K-9 team could earn an aviation, the outstanding dedication to National Safety Medal. The room was packed. Officials in suits, officers in dress blues, pressed with cameras clicking like insects. But it felt smaller, intimate, under the weight of what they had all witnessed. One was security officer Ethan Cole, his uniform pressed but his tie slightly askew, a nervous habit he couldn't shake. The other, four-legged and silent, wore an official K-9 vest with a laser-etched tag in bold letters. Bruno, Unit 17. Ethan adjusted the vest as they stepped up, his fingers brushing the fabric, feeling the dog's warmth beneath. Unlike other awards ceremonies, today had no long speeches, no sappy music swelling in the background. Just the presence of people who knew what they'd narrowly escaped. A plane lost, lives extinguished, trust shattered, and a weighted silence when Bruno's name was called, echoing off the high ceiling. Ethan felt the room shift, a collective breath held as they moved to the podium. The Regional Homeland Security Director, Margaret Chen, stepped forward, gripping the mic with both hands, her dark eyes fixed on the dog sitting calmly at Ethan's feet. Her suit was crisp, her gray hair pulled tight, but her voice carried a warmth that cut through the formality. We've spent billions on detection gear, smart screening systems, AI and data analytics, she said, her tone firm, each word deliberate. High-tech solutions meant to keep us safe, to catch what slips through. But no system, no algorithm did what a dog once labeled overly analytical achieved in a single moment. The room applauded, not loud, not raucous, but slow and steady, like a collective bow, hands clapping in a rhythm that felt more like respect than celebration. Ethan glanced down at Bruno, who didn't flinch, his ears twitching faintly at the sound, but his gaze steady on the crowd, scanning as always. After the ceremony, Ethan was asked to speak. He stepped to the mic, adjusted his tie again, a futile effort, and didn't unfold the crumpled notes in his pocket. He didn't need them. His gaze lingered on Bruno, still sitting, eyes roving the hall as if checking exits, a habit too ingrained to break even here. Then he spoke, slow and clear, his voice rough around the edges but strong. "I thought I saved Bruno." A dog nearly dropped from training. Too slow, not impulsive, never trying to impress anyone with flash or noise. A reject, they said, not fit for the fast pace we demanded. But the truth is, Bruno saved us all. He didn't need orders barked at him, didn't need a crowd to cheer him on. He just needed trust, mine, ours. And I was lucky to trust him at the right moment when everything hung on a thread. The applause this time lasted longer, swelling and fading like a wave, hands clapping with a sincerity that hit Ethan harder than he'd expected. He stepped back, swallowing the lump in his throat, and glanced at Bruno. Bruno didn't bark. He wagged his tail once, enough for those who knew him to catch his "you're welcome," a flicker of acknowledgement before he settled back into stillness, his job done for now. Afterward, as people filed out of the hall, officials shaking hands, officers swapping quiet nods, press packing cameras into bags, Ethan sat beside Bruno on a bench near the stage, unclipped his leash, and rubbed his left ear, his favorite spot, where the fur was softest. The room emptied slowly, voices fading into the corridor, leaving them in a pocket of calm. "Done," Ethan said, his voice soft, a smile tugging at his lips. "You're a national hero now, you know that?" Bruno glanced at him, eyes bright, head tilting slightly as if considering the words. Then, as if nothing big had happened, he stood, stretched with a low groan, shook himself lightly, fur rippling like water, and turned to the hallway, nose twitching at some faint scent drifting in. Ethan knew that look, had seen it 1,000 times on patrol. "Something smell off out there?" He chuckled, rising to his feet, the ache in his knees a faint reminder of the long day. "All right, let's go." Bruno led, steps even, ears up, eyes scanning instinctively, a hunter back on the trail. No glory, no waiting for applause, no basking in the glow of the medal now tucked in Ethan's pocket. Just another patrol, another day on duty, the rhythm of their life unbroken. Because to Bruno, saving lives wasn't a triumph to celebrate with fanfare. It was his duty, his job, the sole reason he existed in this K9 unit. A purpose carved into his bones, deeper than any praise could reach. Ethan followed, matching his pace, leash loose in hand, the familiar weight of it a comfort. His partner, the dog once cut for thinking too much, now safeguarded an entire national aviation system, a quiet guardian whose shadow stretched far beyond this hall. And they kept going, toward Terminal 3, where thousands passed daily, none realizing a four-legged hero had just walked by, his paws silent on the tile, his nose already searching for the next threat, the next truth. Bruno wasn't the fastest dog, nor the flashiest in training, his name absent from the early rosters of stars. But his persistence, precision, and unerring instinct had saved hundreds, and stopped a plot the world might have paid for with lives, a ripple that could have spread far beyond O'Hare's gates. Ethan thought of the snow outside, still falling, blanketing the runways in white, and felt a quiet resolve settle in his chest. Bruno didn't need speed to shine. He just needed to be Bruno. In a world leaning ever more on tech and data, screens glowing with promises of safety, sometimes the only thing you need to trust is a nose, four legs, and a loyal heart. A truth Ethan had learned the hard way, and one he'd never forget. Have you ever trusted a dog's hunch, even when no one else did? Share your story in the comments below. Let us hear how instinct won out. If you think Bruno's journey deserves to spread, like, share, and subscribe for more tales of heroic canines to come. Because this isn't the end of his story, just the beginning. But Bruno's tale doesn't stop at the medal ceremony or the flicker of TV screens. It stretches back and forward, a thread woven through moments big and small, a legacy that grew beyond that snowy day in Chicago. Ethan often thought of the early days, the ones no one wrote about, when Bruno's quiet brilliance first hinted at what he'd become. One such memory surfaced months later, over a lukewarm coffee in the K9 break room, as he swapped stories with a rookie handler, eager for tips. It was a quiet afternoon at a regional cargo hub, long before the Maddox case shook the world, when Bruno had paused mid-patrol near a stack of unmarked crates. The manifest checked out, paperwork pristine, stamps in order. The scanners showed nothing but standard freight, and the warehouse crew waved Ethan off with impatient grunts, insisting it was just routine shipments of machine parts. But Bruno wouldn't budge, his body a still silhouette against the towering boxes. His nose locked on something Ethan couldn't see. Ethan remembered the weight of that moment, the way the crew's eyes rolled, the muttered new guy and his slow dog that stung his pride. Bruno sat, stared, and let out a single low growl, not loud enough to alarm, but firm enough to make Ethan's gut twist. Against protocol and the crew's grumbling, he ordered a manual check, his voice steady despite the doubt creeping in. They pried open a crate, digging through layers of packing foam, and there, buried deep, was a small package of smuggled precursor chemicals, odorless to humans, but glaring to Bruno's nose. Not explosive yet, just raw ingredients, but enough to build something deadly if assembled elsewhere. The discovery led to a minor bust, a few arrests, low-level runners, nothing flashy, and a stern warning from Ethan's supervisor about wasting time on hunches when we've got machines for that. But Ethan knew then, Bruno's nose didn't waste time. It saved it, sniffing out a thread that could have unraveled into something worse. That quiet moment, uncelebrated and barely logged in some dusty report, was the first spark of a trust that would later stop a catastrophe. Another memory came from a training exercise gone awry, one Ethan rarely shared, but often replayed in the stillness of late nights. It was a joint drill with multiple K9 units at an abandoned factory south of Dallas, a sprawling relic of rusted steel and broken glass designed to test speed and coordination under pressure. The goal was simple: locate a hidden bomb, a mock device planted by instructors within a 20-minute window, a clock ticking loud over the radio. The other dogs, high-energy Malinois and Shepherds with names like Blitz and Titan, raced through the site, barking at decoys and chasing false leads with relentless zeal, their handlers shouting commands into the wind. Ethan watched them go, their dust trails swirling, while Bruno took a different path. True to form, Bruno didn't rush. He walked the perimeter, sniffed corners others ignored, his paws deliberate on the cracked concrete, his tail low but steady. The other handlers smirked, one muttering, "Too late for the thinker," as the timer dipped below 5 minutes. Ethan felt the pressure, the sting of their glances, but held his ground, trusting Bruno's pace. The dog stopped at a rusted HVAC unit near the back wall, a hulking thing no one had bothered to check, its vents clogged with dust and cobwebs. He pawed the vent, sat, and refused to move, his eyes locked on Ethan, a silent "here" that cut through the chaos. The timer was down to 3 minutes when Ethan called it in, waving off skeptical looks from the team, his voice firm over the radio. "Check the vent, now!" They pried it open, metal screeching, and inside, wedged behind a loose panel, was the mock device, a tangle of wires and fake plastique missed by every scanner, every dog, every human but Bruno. The instructors later admitted they designed it to be nearly impossible, a test of failure more than success, a curveball meant to trip up even the best. Bruno didn't fail. He rewrote the drill's outcome, turning a washout into a win. Ethan got a quiet nod from the lead trainer, a grizzled vet who rarely praised, and a muttered lucky guess from a rival handler with a Malinois still panting from chasing shadows. Ethan didn't argue. He just patted Bruno's head, feeling the dog's steady breath under his hand, and knew it wasn't luck. It was Bruno, seeing what no one else could, a lesson in patience that stuck with Ethan long after the dust settled. Then there was the time Bruno saved more than just passengers, an incident that hit closer to home, one Ethan carried like a stone in his chest. It happened during a routine sweep of O'Hare's employee parking lot, a mundane task most K9 teams treated as a formality, a box to check before clocking out. Ethan was distracted that day, tired from a double shift that left his eyes gritty, worried about a call from home, his sister struggling with bills, asking for help he couldn't easily give. His mind was elsewhere, drifting through numbers and guilt. When Bruno stayed sharp, his focus a lifeline Ethan didn't know he needed. Near a row of staff vehicles, Bruno froze mid-step, ears twitching, then veered toward a beat-up sedan parked crookedly in a far corner, its paint chipped and tires sagging. Ethan barely noticed at first, lost in his thoughts, his boots scuffing the asphalt until Bruno's insistent whine snapped him back. A sharp, urgent sound that cut through the fog. The dog circled the car, pawed the trunk, and growled. A rumble Ethan hadn't heard in weeks, low and steady like a warning drum. Ethan blinked, shaking off his haze, and radioed it in, half expecting another reprimand for overreacting. His voice flat over the static. "Got an alert. Need a check on a vehicle. Southeast lot." The search revealed a leaking canister of toxic gas. Carbon monoxide, left by a maintenance worker who'd forgotten it after a late-night repair. Its valve corroded and hissing faintly. It wasn't a bomb or a plot, just human error, sloppy and mundane. But the canister was unstable, minutes from rupturing into a cloud that could have killed dozens in the lot, including Ethan himself, standing too close in his distraction. The worker got a suspension, Ethan got a pat on the back from a supervisor who didn't ask why he'd been off, and Bruno got a treat. A measly biscuit Ethan wished was more. But for Ethan, it was personal, a debt he couldn't repay. Bruno hadn't just protected strangers that day. He'd kept Ethan alive to go home, to answer that call, to keep fighting another day. That quiet loyalty, that unspoken bond, deepened their partnership beyond words, a tether that held when Ethan's own grip faltered. Another tale came from a colleague's memory, shared over coffee in the K9 break room weeks after the AA2184 incident. the steam curling between them as they unwound. Officer Maria Torres, a veteran handler with a Malinois named Rex, recalled a joint operation at a train station, a sprawling commuter hub south of the city, during a bomb threat scare that had the brass on edge. Hundreds of bags littered the platforms, the noise a wall of chaos, announcements blaring, heels clicking, voices shouting over the din, and a ticking clock loomed over the radio, urging speed. Rex and the other dogs tore through the crowd, hitting on anything faintly suspicious, their barks sharp and relentless, handlers struggling to keep up as false positives piled high. Maria's voice tightened as she described it, her hands gripping her mug. Rex was everywhere. Too much energy, too many scents. I could barely hold him. Bruno, tethered to Ethan, took a different tack. He ignored the chaos, weaving through the throng with a calm that unsettled Maria at first, her brow furrowing as she watched. She'd thought him lazy, too slow for the stakes, her Malinois outpacing him in bounds. Then near a trash bin by the platform, Bruno stopped, sat, and stared. Not at the bin, but at a man walking away, his coat too heavy for the warm day, his steps too quick. Ethan followed his gaze, flagged the guy with a quiet hold up over the radio, and found a concealed switchblade laced with explosive residue. Not the main threat, but a lead to a bigger cache stashed in a locker nearby. A duffel packed with enough to level half the station. Maria admitted she'd misjudged Bruno that day, her voice softening as she met Ethan's eyes. Rex would have barked at the bin and missed the guy. Too loud, too fast. Your dog doesn't just find trouble, he finds the source. I've never seen anything like it. Ethan nodded, sipping his coffee, the warmth steadying him as her words sank in. That story stuck with him, a testament to Bruno's rare gift. Seeing what others couldn't, even when the world moved too fast to notice. A clarity that cut through noise and haste. It wasn't flash or fury, it was focus, pure and unyielding. A trait that had carried them from that station to the terminal, from a blade to a bomb. These moments, small and scattered, built the foundation for Bruno's triumph in the Maddox case. Bricks laid in silence over years of trust. They weren't splashed across headlines or etched on metals. Most barely made it into reports, fading into the hum of routine. But they shaped Ethan's faith in his partner, a faith that held firm when the stakes soared to 243 lives and beyond. And as Bruno's fame grew, so did the stories from others touched by his quiet heroism, a ripple spreading through the airport's veins. A janitor at O'Hare, a wiry man with a mop and a shy grin, swore Bruno once nudged him away from a slippery spill in a back hallway, his broom clattering as the dog's nose pushed his leg, a small save from a fall that could have broken his hip, a kindness unnoticed by the crowds above. Ethan overheard it in passing, the man's voice low as he swept, and smiled to himself, picturing Bruno's gentle nudge. A TSA rookie, barely a month on the job, claimed Bruno's steady presence during her first chaotic shift. Bags piling, passengers yelling, kept her from quitting, her hands shaking until she saw the dog sit calm amid the storm, an anchor she clung to. She told Ethan over a rushed lunch, her eyes bright with gratitude, and he nodded, knowing Bruno's calm was contagious. Even a kid at the award ceremony, tugging his mom's sleeve in the crowd, said he wanted a dog like Bruno to keep bad guys away, his voice piping up as Ethan passed, a spark of awe that made Ethan pause. The mother laughed, ruffling the boy's hair, but Ethan caught the kid's stare, wide, earnest, and thought of how Bruno's story had reached even there, to a child who'd never know the cockpit's shadow. Each tale, trivial or profound, wove into the larger narrative. Bruno wasn't just a tool or a hero. He was a constant, a presence that steadied those around him, a dog who didn't need to bark to be heard. For Ethan, these side stories weren't just anecdotes. They were proof, living evidence of a truth he'd staked his career on. Proof that Bruno's precision wasn't a fluke, that his stillness wasn't weakness, that his loyalty wasn't blind, but razor sharp. They were the unseen chapters of a journey that began in a dusty Texas training yard, where a dog too slow for the pack found a handler willing to wait, and peaked in a snowbound airport, where that same dog stopped a nightmare with a single growl. Ethan sipped his coffee that day in the break room, the rookie handler still talking, and felt the weight of it settle. Bruno had always been more than they'd seen, a force waiting for the world to catch up. And there was another story, one Ethan kept closer, a memory from a night patrol that felt like a lifetime ago, but lingered like yesterday. It was late fall, the air crisp and sharp, the terminal half empty as flights wound down. Ethan was new to the K-9 unit then, still proving himself, still learning Bruno's quirks. They were sweeping a baggage claim area, a cavernous space of humming belts and flickering lights, when Bruno stopped near a cluster of unclaimed suitcases, his nose twitching at a battered green duffel tucked against a pillar. Ethan sighed. Another lost bag, another delay. But Bruno's growl was low, insistent, a sound that pulled Ethan out of his fatigue. He called it in, expecting nothing, his voice flat over the radio. Got an alert, baggage claim 3, probably junk. The response was slow, aboard check it anyway from dispatch, and Ethan knelt, unzipping the bag with gloved hands, Bruno at his side. Inside, no clothes, no toiletries, just a tangle of wires, a battery pack, and a crude timer ticking faintly under a layer of duct tape. Not live, not yet. A prototype, abandoned or forgotten, but enough to stop Ethan's heart, his breath freezing in his chest. Bomb squad came, suits were filed, and a quiet investigation traced it to a baggage handler with a rap sheet, a test run that never took off. Ethan got a nod from his chief, a good catch scribbled in his file, but no one asked about Bruno. Just another day, another bag. Ethan didn't forget, though. He'd sat with Bruno after, the dog chewing a treat in the dim light of the K-9 kennel, and realized this wasn't just a job, it was a calling. One Bruno answered before Ethan even knew the question. That night shaped him, taught him to listen when Bruno spoke, to trust when others doubted. A lesson that echoed years later in Terminal 5, when a pilot's uniform hid a darker truth. And then there was the storm, a literal one, not just the snow of AA 2184, but a thunderstorm that hit O'Hare a year prior, a deluge that grounded flights and flooded the lower levels. Ethan and Bruno were on duty, slogging through ankle-deep water in a service tunnel, checking for damage or leaks. Routine, until Bruno stopped at a rusted grate, his nose flaring, his growl cutting through the rain's roar. Ethan frowned, the water cold around his boots, and peered closer. A faint chemical tang, a shimmer of oil on the surface. He radioed it, expecting a spill, but hazmat found more. Barrels of flammable solvent, improperly stored, cracked and leaking from a maintenance closet above. A spark away from turning the tunnel into an inferno. The cleanup took hours. The praise was minimal, a memo about vigilance. But Ethan knew Bruno had smelled disaster where no one looked, his nose piercing the storm's chaos to find a threat no scanner could have caught. That day lingered in Ethan's mind, a quiet victory that proved Bruno's worth beyond bombs, beyond headlines. A dog who saw the invisible, who saved what others didn't know was lost. These stories piled up, a mosaic of moments that built the Bruno Ethan knew, the one who'd faced Drexler and won. And as his fame spread, Ethan heard more. From a gate agent who'd seen Bruno sniff out a smuggler's cash stash in a hollowed-out book, to a mechanic who swore the dog had nudged him away from a loose fuel line during a hangar sweep. Each added a layer, a brushstroke to a portrait no metal could capture. Ethan thought of all this as he walked Bruno through Terminal 3 that day after the ceremony. The leash slack, their steps synced in a rhythm older than the chaos around them. The snow still fell outside, a white curtain against the glass, and Ethan knew the story wasn't over. Somewhere out there, Frankfurt, Paris, or beyond, Obsidian's shadow lingered, its web unspooling, its next move hidden in the storm. But with Bruno at his side, Ethan felt ready, not just to react, but to anticipate, to outthink, to protect. Because Bruno didn't just save the day, he redefined it. A dog whose quiet strength rewrote the rules, one sniff at a time.